It is not the fault everyone was watching. That's the first thing you need to understand. For years, scientists studying the Philippines have kept one eye on the West Valley Fault, the crack in the earth running straight under 10 million people in Metro Manila. But on June 8th, 2026, at 7:37 in the morning, the ground broke somewhere else entirely, 800 kilometers south of Manila, off the coast of a province called Sarangani, on the southern island of Mindanao. A magnitude 7. 8. Earthquake tore through the seafloor. It was the strongest earthquake to hit the Philippines in 50 years. Buildings swayed as far away as Davao City, more than 100 kilometers from the epicenter. A shopping mall partially collapsed in General Santos. And within hours, geophysicists who had spent the last year quietly warning about exactly this kind of scenario started asking an uncomfortable question out loud. Did this earthquake just load the gun for the next one? Not eventually, not someday. Possibly this year, on a stretch of fault that hasn't broken in 3/4 of a century and quite possibly not since 1918. This is the story of what happened in Mindanao, what it confirmed about the Philippine Fault system, and why the danger from this earthquake isn't behind us. It's arguably just getting started. Before we get into it, here's the deal. This isn't a doom video. No exaggeration, no filling in the blanks with speculation dressed up as certainty. Everything here is pulled from PHIVOLCS, the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, the U.S. Geological Survey, and peer-reviewed stress modeling published by seismologists who study this exact fault system for a living. And here's a question worth sitting with while we go through it. If you live anywhere near an active fault line, do you actually know which one it is and when it last ruptured? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how many of you know. And if you want more of these fact-checked breakdowns of the disasters actually reshaping the world around us, subscribing is free. It just means you won't miss the next one. A thumbs up helps this reach the people who need to see it. Let's push for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into it. At 7:37 a.m. Philippine Standard Time on June 8th, 2026, the Earth let go roughly 24 kilometers southwest of a small coastal community called Cabalan in Sarangani Province. The rupture initiated about 55 kilometers beneath the surface, and it lasted somewhere around 70 seconds. 70 seconds is nothing on paper. It is an eternity if you're standing in the middle of it. PHIVOLCS initially clocked the quake at magnitude 7. 0. Within hours, that number was revised upward. The final reading came in at moment magnitude 7. 8. The U.S. Geological Survey agreed with that figure. The mechanism was thrust faulting, one slab of the Earth's crust grinding up and over another, and it happened along the Cotabato Trench, a subduction zone where the floor of the Celebes Sea is being dragged down beneath the southern Philippines at a rate of roughly 7 centimeters a year. Here's what that looked like on the ground. Intensity 9, classified as violent shaking, struck an estimated 7,000 people in western Sarangani. Another 1.5 million people across General Santos City, Glan, and Polomolak were hit with intensity 8, severe shaking. In total, more than 6 million people across southern and central Mindanao felt this earthquake in some form. In General Santos City, the city hall partially collapsed. So did a building housing a Jollibee restaurant and a radio studio. A structure at Notre Dame of Dariangas University came down. A 36-story condominium tower in Davao City swayed so violently on camera that the footage went viral before rescue crews had even reached the hardest-hit villages further south. Multiple people were trapped in the rubble of a 2-story school. This happened on the very first day of the new school year. More than 2 million students across 5 regions were either already in their classrooms or lining up for flag ceremony when the shaking started. The coastline itself physically moved. Along a 100-kilometer stretch near the towns of Glan and Jose Abad Santos, the earthquake lifted the shoreline by up to 2 meters and pushed it outward by as much as 200 meters, exposing coral reefs and tide pools that had sat underwater for generations. A tsunami followed, 0.5 meter in Davao City, but as high as 2.5 meters at a town called Labac, where PHIVOLCS survey teams later measured the wave pushing 18 meters inland. At Calamansig, boats were carried onto dry land. On Balut Island, the wave was strong enough to rip a boulder the size of a small car, roughly 1.2 by 0.7 by 2.5 meters, clean off the reef and drag it 30 meters across the flat. By late June, the human toll stood at 81 confirmed dead, more than 130 injured, and 31 people still missing. Break that down by province, and the picture sharpens. 33 deaths in Sarangani, 24 in South Cotabato, 20 in Davao Occidental. In the town of Glan alone, considered one of the worst-hit municipalities anywhere in the disaster zone, 23 people died, and more than half the town's housing stock, 52%, either collapsed outright or was damaged. In neighboring Malapatan, that number climbed even higher, 74% of homes damaged or destroyed. In Jose Abad Santos, 2 landslides killed 7 people and left 18 more unaccounted for. One of those landslides buried a barangay so completely that it formed a landslide dam and created an entirely new lake where a village used to stand. Residents were later told to simply relocate rather than wait for the water to recede. Across Mindanao as a whole, more than 113,000 homes were damaged, and over 18,000 of those were destroyed outright. The economic picture is just as stark. Property losses in General Santos alone topped 1 billion pesos, roughly 20 million US dollars. And General Santos isn't just any city. It's the tuna capital of the Philippines, home to major canning and export operations, supplying seafood well beyond Southeast Asia. Two of its largest tuna exporters suspended operations after the quake. In Sarangani, the coastal uplift alone is estimated to have wiped out 70 billion pesos, close to 1.4 billion US dollars, in damaged marine resources. Coral, fisheries, an entire nearshore ecosystem heaved bodily out of the water in 70 seconds. The country's Department of Education reported more than 1,000 schools damaged and nearly 200 classrooms destroyed outright, with an estimated repair cost north of 43 million pesos, on top of the immediate disruption to more than 3 million students. Power was cut to more than 800,000 households. 4 separate local governments declared states of calamity. President Bongbong Marcos flew in personally to assess the damage and pledged 50,000 pesos to every family that lost someone. Now here's an important piece of context, because I don't want to overstate what this earthquake actually was. This was not technically the Philippine Fault rupturing. This was the Cotabato Trench, a completely different structure, a subduction zone where one tectonic plate dives beneath another. The Philippine Fault is something else entirely. A 1,500-kilometer strike-slip fault, more like California's San Andreas, running the length of the entire archipelago from northern Luzon down through the Visayas and into Mindanao. It sits geographically between the Cotabato Trench and the Philippine Trench, sandwiched in what seismologists literally describe as a tectonic vise. And that distinction, trench versus fault, is exactly why what happened next mattered so much. Because it's the difference between a single, isolated earthquake and a signal about an entire regional system waking up. Because 2 things were true at the same time in the days after June 8th. First, by June 19th, Five Oaks had logged more than 8,500 aftershocks, 3 of them above magnitude 6. 0, the strongest hitting 6. 5. Second, and this is the part that should get your attention, seismologists Ross Stein and Shinji Toda, publishing through the earthquake science outlet Temblor just 3 days after the main shock, ran a Coulomb stress transfer analysis, a well-established technique that calculates how an earthquake redistributes stress onto the surrounding crust. And they found something unsettling. The 100-kilometer stretch of the Cotabato Trench immediately adjacent to the rupture, a segment that hasn't broken since at least 1950, and quite possibly not since a magnitude 8. The 3 earthquake in 1918 had been pushed measurably closer to failure by the June 8th quake. Not maybe closer, measurably closer, according to the stress models. At the trench's convergence rate of roughly 25 millimeters a year, Stein and Toda calculate that at least 2 meters of slip has already built up in that gap, unreleased. Their estimate for what that could produce, if and when it lets go. Another magnitude, 7. 6 to 7. 8 earthquake. Their words, not mine. And I want to be honest about the hedge here, because this channel doesn't pretend science is more certain than it actually is. No aftershocks have yet lit up in that specific loaded zone, which the researchers themselves admit is a genuine mystery. But the stress is there. The math says so. And Stein and Toda specifically flagged that the Philippine Fault itself, that separate 1,500-kilometer strike-slip system, also runs directly adjacent to this stress field. Close enough that the southernmost Mindanao section of it may be closer to failure too. Here's where this story gets bigger than one earthquake in one province. Because this isn't actually the first warning, it's the second. Rewind 14 months to March 28th, 2025. Central Myanmar, a magnitude 7. 7 earthquakes struck near Mandalay on a fault called the Sagaing Fault, a right lateral strike-slip fault more than 500 kilometers long, running the length of the country. More than 5,000 people died in Myanmar. A high-rise under construction in Bangkok, 1,000 kilometers away, collapsed. 40 apartment buildings were damaged in Ho Chi Minh City, 250 kilometers from the epicenter. That's the range of destruction a major strike-slip fault rupture can inflict. And that's exactly why a team of Filipino geologists, led by Dr. Mario Aurelio at the University of the Philippines, sat up and took notice. Because the Philippine Fault is structurally almost a twin of the Sagaing Fault, roughly the same length, about 1,500 kilometers. The same basic mechanism, a strike-slip system slicing an entire country in half. Left lateral instead of right lateral, but geologically close cousins. And here's the detail that made the Myanmar quake so significant to the Philippine team. The Mandalay segment that ruptured in March 2025 had been independently forecast years earlier, back in 2017, by researchers using Coulomb's stress modeling to flag it as overdue. That forecast came true. The method worked. So Aurelio's team ran the same analysis on the Philippine Fault. They pulled 52 years of seismic data, every earthquake of magnitude 5. 0 or greater recorded on the fault since 1973, more than 60 events in total, about 10 of them destructive, which works out to roughly one major damaging Philippine Fault earthquake every 5 years. They built a Coulomb stress transfer model across the entire 1,500-kilometer length of the fault, tracking how each major rupture had pushed stress onto its neighbors over 5 decades. And they found what researchers call quiet segments, sections of the fault that haven't ruptured in the observed record, but which the math says have been steadily loading with stress from the earthquakes happening around them. 3 segments stood out: the southern Leyte segment in the central Philippines, the San Francisco Agusan del Norte segment in the southern Philippines, and most alarmingly, the Infanta segment in northern Luzon, which sits roughly 60 kilometers from Metro Manila. That segment has been absorbing stress transfer from 2 major historical earthquakes, the 1973 magnitude 7, 5 Arugay Gulf quake, and the 1990 magnitude 7 North Luzon earthquake, which killed 1,721 people and tore a surface rupture roughly 125 kilometers long along the Digdig Fault, one of the Philippine Fault's northern branches, devastating the city of Baguio in the process. Both of those quakes pumped stress into the Infanta segment. Neither has been released since. And this wasn't the model's first correct call inside the Philippines either, which is part of why the researchers trusted it enough to publish a warning in the first place. Their own stress maps show the 1990 North Luzon earthquake appears to have directly promoted 2 later ruptures, 32 years afterward: the July 2022 magnitude 7 Zadiro Abra earthquake, and an October 2022 magnitude 6. 4 events, both of which struck within the stress increase zone the 1990 quake had left behind. Separately, the 1973 Arugay Gulf earthquake appears to have loaded Masbate Island with stress that got released in 3 separate magnitude 6. 0+ earthquakes in 2003, 2020, and 2023, all 3 clustered within roughly a 40-kilometer stretch of fault, each one plausibly nudging the next closer to failure. That's the track record behind this method on Philippine soil specifically, before Myanmar ever confirmed it internationally, and before Mindanao arguably confirmed it again this year. The published title of that paper, and I promise I'm not paraphrasing this to sound more dramatic than it is, Beware Quiet Segments of the Philippine Fault. That was May 2025, 13 months before Mindanao broke. And here's the myth to bust, because I know exactly what a lot of you are thinking right now, and I want to correct it honestly, rather than let the panic run wild in either direction. Is the June 2026 Mindanao earthquake proof that the big one, the long-feared Metro Manila earthquake on the West Valley Fault, is imminent? No, and I want to be precise about why, because getting this wrong in either direction does you a disservice. For context, the West Valley Fault is a separate branch of the broader Philippine Fault zone that runs directly beneath several cities in Metro Manila. PHIVOLCS has publicly estimated it's capable of producing a magnitude 7, 2 earthquake, with a historical recurrence interval somewhere in the range of 200 to 400 years. That's a real, well-documented, entirely separate hazard, and it existed long before June 8th, and it still exists now, completely on its own timeline. But it's a completely different fault segment from anything that ruptured in Mindanao. It did not move. Nothing about the June 8th earthquake mechanically triggered it. Stress transfer along a fault complex like this doesn't work like a chain of dominoes across the entire archipelago. It's local and directional, radiating outward from a rupture in specific, calculable patterns, not jumping 1,000 kilometers to an unrelated structure. What actually happened is narrower, and in some ways more useful to understand. A real earthquake on a real monitored trench has now demonstrated, in real time with real aftershock data, that the underlying method scientists use to flag quiet danger zones on the neighboring Philippine Fault is producing results that match what's unfolding on the ground at the Cotabato Trench right next door. That's not a prophecy of imminent Manila doom. It's confirmation that the tool works on the same tectonic system, one province away. The Infanta segment near Manila remains a genuine published, scientifically flagged concern, but flagged as loading with stress over 50 years and about to rupture this year are 2 very different sentences. Only one of them is what the researchers actually said. So how does this actually work under the hood? Let's walk through the mechanism plainly. Earthquakes happen because the Earth's crust is brittle, not smooth. Tectonic plates grind against each other, but they don't slide freely, they lock. Friction holds 2 blocks of rock together while the plates underneath keep trying to move. Stress builds. Elastic strain accumulates in the rock itself, like bending a stick slowly and slowly and slowly. Eventually, the friction fails, the lock breaks, and the accumulated strain releases all at once. That's the earthquake. Decades, sometimes centuries, of stored motion catching up in a matter of seconds. Now, Coulomb stress transfer is the tool scientists use to model what happens next. When a fault ruptures, it doesn't just release stress, it redistributes it, like squeezing one end of a water balloon and watching the pressure bulge out somewhere else. Some patches of surrounding crust get pushed away from failure, what's called a stress shadow. Other patches get pushed toward failure, closer to their own breaking point, a stress trigger zone. Researchers model this using the fault's geometry, the direction of slip, and the friction properties of the surrounding rock, then map where the triggered zones land. It's not a crystal ball. It can't give you a date. What it can do, and what it did successfully in Myanmar, is identify which specific stretches of a fault system are becoming mechanically primed years, or even decades, before they let go. There's also a phenomenon researchers call the corona effect, a concept Hoda and Stein themselves developed in earlier work, where the core of a rupture zone actually shuts down aftershock activity within about 5 years, while a much larger surrounding corona keeps producing aftershocks, and potentially entirely new main shocks, for up to 30 years afterward. That's the timescale we're actually talking about here. Not next week, not necessarily even next year. A multi-decade window in which the loaded zones are mechanically more dangerous than they were before June 8th. It's a genuinely strange thing to sit with, a hazard that doesn't come with a countdown clock, only a probability that quietly ticks upward and stays elevated for a generation. It's worth pausing on just how consistently this exact stretch of the Philippines produces earthquakes in clusters rather than isolated events, because it's a pattern that keeps repeating, and it's part of why scientists take the current warning seriously. In 2010, a pair of earthquakes measuring magnitude 7, 5, and 7. 6 struck just 30 kilometers and 25 minutes apart. In 2019, 3, arguably 4 if you count a magnitude 6. 4 event, large earthquakes struck close together in time and space just north of General Santos, northeast of Davao City. 3 large shocks clustered together in 2023 and 2024, with the second 2 likely aftershocks of the first. And in the years leading directly up to June 2026, a magnitude 6, 9 quake in 2017 and a magnitude 6, 7 quake in 2023, both struck in the exact epicentral region of what would eventually become the magnitude 7, 8 main shock. Researchers are now looking back at those 2 events and wondering cautiously whether they were foreshocks of what was coming, even though nothing about them stood out as unusual at the time, which is itself an uncomfortable lesson. There have also been active earthquake swarms recorded along the Cotabato Trench in the run-up to the main shock, the Palimeng swarm, which began in 2025, and the Calamansig swarm, which started in 2026, both named for the towns nearest their activity. None of these individually told anyone a magnitude 7. 8 earthquake was coming on June 8th. Together, in hindsight, they paint a picture of a fault system that had been restless for years before it finally broke. It's also worth understanding that not every quiet stretch of the Philippine Fault is quiet for the same reason, and this is where the science gets genuinely interesting rather than just alarming. Some segments are locked, stuck, accumulating strain with nowhere to go until they eventually rupture in a large, sudden earthquake. Other segments of the Philippine Fault are known to creep, sliding slowly and continuously, releasing stress gradually instead of storing it up. The central segment of the fault running through Leyte Island is the best studied example. GPS and satellite radar measurements there have clocked creep rates around 20 to 33 millimeters a year in places, quietly relieving pressure without a major quake. But even creeping segments aren't fully safe. In July 2017, a magnitude 6. 5 earthquakes struck Ormoc City on Leyte, rupturing a roughly 28-kilometer stretch of ground that had been creeping for years. Proof that a segment can be releasing some stress aseismically and still store up enough in an isolated locked patch to eventually snap. That distinction, creeping versus fully locked, is exactly what makes Coulomb stress modeling so valuable and so difficult at the same time. You need to know not just how much stress a segment has absorbed, but whether that segment is the kind of ground that quietly bleeds pressure off, or the kind that hoards it until it can't anymore. The Infanta segment near Manila, the southern Leyte segment, and the Agusan del Norte segment near Mindanao's east coast were all flagged in the 2025 study specifically because they show little evidence of creep, which means, in the researchers' framing, whatever stress they've absorbed over the past 50 years is very likely still sitting there, locked in, waiting. One more piece of context worth sitting with, because it explains why this stretch of the planet behaves so differently from earthquake zones you might already be familiar with. Mindanao and the wider Philippine archipelago sit in what geologists literally call a tectonic vise. The islands are being squeezed from 2 directions simultaneously, compressed by opposing subduction zones on the east and west at roughly the same 50 millimeters a year, while also being sheared sideways by the Philippine Fault slicing through the middle. Compare that to Southern California, a region of almost identical size that most of you have probably heard called earthquake country. In the same 10-year window that produced 17 earthquakes of magnitude 6, 5 are larger in the southern Philippines, 7 of them above magnitude 7. 0, Southern California produced exactly 1 earthquake above magnitude 6. 5, the 2019 Ridgecrest quake. One region is being pulled, the other is being crushed from both sides while also being sheared sideways. That's the geological reality 6 million Mindanao residents are living inside of. And it's the same reality that produced the 1976 Morro Gulf earthquake, magnitude 8. 0, on the same Cotabato Trench, which killed roughly 8,000 people and remains, 50 years later, the deadliest earthquake this region has ever produced. The 1976 rupture tore along a roughly 160-kilometer stretch of the trench and triggered a tsunami that devastated coastal towns across the Morro Gulf with almost no warning, at a time before any modern tsunami monitoring network existed there. June 8, 2026 was the strongest earthquake since that one. Not the biggest possible, the strongest since. And based on the historical record, a major rupture at this trench in 1918, another in 1976, and now this one in 2026, this stretch of the Philippines simply does not go quiet for long, not by geological standards. So what do you actually do with information like this if you live in the Philippines, or honestly anywhere near a major strike slip or subduction fault system? Because none of this mechanism is unique to one country. First, know your fault specifically. Five Oaks maintains public fault maps through its GeoRisk Philippines platform. Take 5 minutes and find out whether your home, your workplace, or your kid's school sits on or near a mapped active trace. That single piece of information changes almost everything else you do next. Second, retrofit before you evacuate. This is the boring advice, the unglamorous advice, but it's also the advice backed by the casualty data from every major fault line earthquake on record. If you're in an older concrete structure, particularly anything built before the country's updated National Building Code, seismic provisions, a structural assessment from a licensed engineer is not overkill. It's the single highest leverage thing you can do, because the overwhelming majority of earthquake deaths worldwide come from building collapse, not from the shaking itself. Third, if you live on or near a coastline anywhere along the Cotabato Trench, the Philippine Trench, or the Manila Trench, know your vertical evacuation route before you need it. Not the nearest high ground on a map, the actual route, walked in advance because the Labak tsunami arrived with almost no warning, and the run-in there reached deep enough inland to catch anyone who hesitated. Fourth, build a genuine 72-hour kit, not a symbolic one. Water, a way to purify more, any medications your household needs, cash and small bills since card networks and ATMs go down along with the power grid, and copies of critical documents in a waterproof bag, because 800,000 households in Mindanao lost power in a single morning. Fifth, and this one's less obvious, but it matters. Talk to your family now about where you'll meet if you're separated when it happens, because phone networks jam immediately after a major quake, and you do not want to be improvising a reunion plan while buildings are still settling around you. And sixth, if you work in or run a business out of an older commercial building, ask directly whether it's ever had a post-quake structural inspection, the way General Santos's malls and universities scrambled to do, only after the shaking had already happened. The buildings that collapsed on June 8th weren't unknown risks the day before. They were just risks nobody had gotten around to checking. So here's the honest summary. No dramatizing, just where things actually stand. On June 8th, 2026, the Cotabato Trench in the southern Philippines produced the country's strongest earthquake in 50 years, killing at least 81 people and physically reshaping the coastline of an entire province. It was not technically a rupture of the Philippine Fault itself, but it sits close enough geologically that the scientists' own stress models say a 100-kilometer gap on the adjacent trench, unbroken since at least 1950, has now been pushed measurably closer to failure, with roughly 2 meters of accumulated slip waiting to release. That's not speculation dressed up as science. That's the same Coulomb stress transfer method that correctly flagged Myanmar's Mandalay segment more than a year before it ruptured. The same method that, 13 months before Mindanao broke, had already flagged 3 separate quiet segments of the neighboring Philippine Fault, including one just 60 kilometers from 10 million people in Metro Manila. Nothing about this means Manila's fault is next, and nothing about this means it isn't. What it means is that the tool scientists have been using to find the Philippines' next dangerous earthquake just proved in real time, on the fault line right next door, that it's finding the right places to look. We'll keep tracking this as the aftershock sequence develops and as new stress modeling comes in. Subscribe so you don't miss the update when it happens. It's completely free, and it genuinely helps more people see coverage like this instead of the exaggerated stuff. Leave a comment and let me know if you knew, before this video, which fault line is closest to where you live. Let's get this one to 5,000 likes. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.